thank you both very, very much. And I'm very excited that Michael is here because at the end, when there are questions, if there are any that I can't answer, we can direct them to him. So as has been suggested, John Randel did a lot of very different things. He was involved with the grid. He was involved with an elevated railroad later in his life. He had a whole life outside of New York City that I'm going to talk about a little bit. But to give you some background, because I think it's also relevant very much for some of the work I'm interested in today, he also had a legacy that extended beyond just the maps and sort of understanding property and the history of New York City. He's contributed data that has been very, very important for scientists who are working on projects today. And that actually is how I became interested in Randel in the first place. There's the book, there's Randel, later in life. The book came out of an article that I was doing on the Mannahatta Project, which was another exhibit that was here at the Museum of the City of New York in 2009. Eric Sanderson of the Wildlife Conservation Society had moved to New York City from California. He'd been browsing in the Strand bookstore, and he'd happened across this book, Manhattan in Maps, which is an extraordinary collection of New York City's history in maps that Paul Cohen and Robert Augustine did. And he was looking through it, and he fell upon this page. Many of you are familiar with this story, but I just want to explain a little bit because of the connection to Randel. He fell upon this page, which is the British headquarters map that was done during the occupation. And Eric Sanderson, as an ecologist, became just struck by the fact that there was so much topographical detail, and he suddenly started to see the island in this very rich way, and he started thinking, wow, if there is all this topography and I could figure out elevation and slope, I could start to figure out what plants lived where. Depending on which direction they were facing, maybe that would give him a sense of the different ecosystems, the animals that live there. And so this really was the moment that set Eric Sanderson off on the quest to recreate what Manhattan looked like in 1609. He relied heavily on the British headquarters map, and he geo-referenced. He found a lot of points that you can see there's no data, there are no numbers, it's all shading. So you have to discern elevation from the darkness, of the shading. And he geo-referenced a lot using contemporary GPS information, but he also had to turn to John Randel. So as I was following Eric Sanderson around the island and seeing the island through his incredible vision, we would walk down to Rockefeller Center. He would tell me where the tulip trees were, where the marsh was, where the wild turkeys were, how the black bear might be over there. It was this amazing world that he really saw as he walked around. He ended up having to rely a lot on Randel's data. Randel had recorded elevation in his notebooks, which are housed at the New York Historical Society, and on these farm maps that I'm going to show you some images from later, he had marked elevations at different intersections. So essentially, using all of that data, but relying very heavily on Randel, Eric Sanderson was able to put together what became the Mannahatta Project. I became fascinated by the idea that Sanderson was walking around seeing 1609, seeing this wild island, and that about 200 years earlier, there had been this young man walking around what was then a much wilder island, not wild in wilderness sense, but rural, not at all gridded, and that he was only seeing lines and streets. And I thought that was just so amazing that across 200 years, these people were walking the island with such an incredibly different vision. And I became really obsessed with John Randel. And I started trying to find out as much as I could about him. And the article ran, I think, in 2004. The book has just come out, it's 2013. You can get a sense of how long it took to track Randel. And as you know, the main work that he is really famous for is the Commissioner's Plan. He made 3 copies of the plan, manuscript copies of the plan that was issued in 1811. And that's mostly what I found out about him initially. This is just to get at the idea. This is borrowed from the Mannahatta Project, but sort of what Sanderson was seeing on one side, and maybe not quite what Randel was seeing on the other side, but at least closer to what he was seeing. So my quest to find materials on Randel took me on a wild goose chase. A bunch of people, Paul Cohen had written about him and been very intrigued, but had not been able to find all that much material. I discovered a geographer named Reuben Rose Redwood, who did a topographical reconstruction of the island, also based on Randel's data. I'll talk more about that later. He had tried to find a lot of material on Randel. Ralph Gray of the National, he wrote a book called The National Waterway, had tracked down a lot of Randel, who did work on the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, and he had discovered that Randel had been embroiled in this huge lawsuit. But there wasn't an enormous amount. There was no sort of cache of letters. There were letters, some letters in Albany, there were some down in Delaware, there were some in Maryland, there were some that I recalled from Virginia. It seemed he had a relative in Texas. There was stuff in New Jersey. It was all over the place. And it took a long time to get the elements. Most of it, however, turned out to be in the New York Historical Society in these notebooks, these field books. And that covers mostly the period of time that Randel was working on the island. So it's actually the era of Randel's life that we know the most about because we look at these notebooks. He lived an extremely long life. He was born, and for that time, he was born in 1787, and he died in 1865. So he saw enormous changes over that time. And as I say, the most well-documented period is when he was on New York Island for about 12 years. And I'm going to sort of go back and forth and read you a few passages from the book. This is about the notebooks, which I'm going to show you some pictures of. Randel's work on the island can be divided into 3 stages, characterized by increasing precision and obsession and by growing public and personal turmoil. The first period ran from 1808 to the end of 1810. During that time, Randel measured along roughly east-west and north-south lines, getting widths and lengths for streets and blocks using basic equipment. The streets were to run river to facilitate traffic to the docks, and apparently to ensure cross breezes to rid the city of stagnant, unhealthful air. Using those measurements, Randel produced 3 copies of the manuscript map, or unengraved map. This was the famous Commissioner's Plan of 1811. The second stage ran from early 1811 to about 1817, when Randel designed and used more sophisticated instruments and equipment, and during which time he inscribed, scratched into the dirt and rock of the island, the 1811 plan. Randel conducted a geodetic survey, sophisticated, accurate, recording elevation, not just distance, as opposed to a regular land survey. During the last period, which ran from 1818 or so to 1821, Randel, aided by his first wife, Matilda, became a cartographer of the highest quality. Much of what we know about Randel's Manhattan surveys comes from 2 principal sources. The minutes of the Common Council of the City of New York contains records of Randel's reports to the Committee on Surveys and on Roads and Streets. Most of those records concern finances, contracts, and deadlines. The more complete source of information resides in Randel's field books, housed at the New York Historical Society and donated by Joseph O.B. Webster, a former city surveyor and engineer. And if anyone's interested later, there's a story about how the notebooks ended up at the New York Historical Society in the care of Joseph Webster. It's not a complete story, but it's an interesting one involving, as is often true with Randel, finances, legal trouble, and his wives. Almost all 45 field books are thick brown and leather bound. Each opens like a reporter's notebook. Randel ordered them from Obadiah van Benthuizen, an Albany printer. They are simultaneously sparse and rich documents. In some places, they are professionalism embodied. Figures, sine and cosine tables, measurements, sketches and diagrams, a log of ground covered and markers set. Others contain these careful records, as well as tantalizing insights into Randel's personal life between 1808 and 1823, because he drafted letters, copied contracts, mentioned family and friends, and recorded anecdotes, travels for work and pleasure, and my favorite part, recipes. Randel's field books are above all a personal palimpsest of visiting and revisiting, recording, checking, correcting, certifying. It is not unusual for one book to contain entries from as many as 4 years, layered over each other. Irregularities unsettled Randel. His field books are filled with corrections and adjustments and recertifications of his corrections and notes